Hello, in this video I'm going to show you an alternate approach for editing TMs using two text editors. Um, this video is a supplement to the InterText tutorial. I like the InterText application a lot, but there's some issues with using InterText on macOS. It still functions on macOS. The problem is that there's a couple bugs when you move translation units around on the Mac that causes a lot of lag, and it makes it appear as though the units are disappearing until you click within, until you wait like 5 to 10 seconds, or you click inside the a cell. Anyways, it makes it very inconvenient for it works. The InterText works great on Windows and Linux, but there's this issue with Mac. I would say if you're a TM editor and you're just kind of you're beginning with your path of learning Tibetan, perhaps maybe you've only had a year or two of experience, you know, perhaps you could still use InterText because you'll be spending a lot of time looking up words in dictionaries, and the lag won't really matter so much because you'll be spending a lot of time kind of looking at the text. But if you're a little more experienced and you want to get some work done, that lag's going to be an issue. And so I'd like to present this alternate method that we're going to use if you're a Mac, if your computer is a Mac. So basically what we're going to do, the process of aligning translation memories is really simple. We're basically just linking a string of Tibetan with a string of English. So we can basically do this with two text editors. The basic notepad on most Macs and PCs won't quite do because you can't see the line numbers. But if you use a slightly more advanced text editor, and there's plenty of free text editors that do this, you'll see these. It automatically puts in these line numbers every time there's a carriage return, which is, when you hit the return key on the keyboard. It creates a carriage return and line feed, and then most text editors, the slightly more advanced ones, will show you the line number in the left column like this. And so I have two windows open, and these are just plain text files that we've kind of prepared a little bit with some scripts. We prepared them to kind of anticipate where we think the breaks ought to be, and then you, as a TM editor, will refine and correct that. But what we can do is we can use these line numbers to basically line up the text. So as long as the one in this Tibetan text file matches up with the one in the English, then we can align those two strings with a script after we complete the editing. So basically all we're going to do is go through and use the return key to split segments and delete carriage returns to merge them. So it's a very simple process. Now, when we select a text editor, there's kind of three important criteria. that we need to have. So basically, I don't have a Mac, so I'm kind of guessing as to which is going to be a good text editor. I'd love some feedback from a Mac user if you could tell me what's the best one for this process. But the three important criteria is, number one, of course, we need to be able to see the Tibetan properly. This text editor is Atom, by the way, which is supposedly it's sorry, not Sublime Text Atom. Here it is. This is supposedly it's an open source. Is it open source? It's free, whatever the actual copyright mode is, but it supposedly runs on Mac the same way it runs on PC, and on PC it runs very smoothly and fulfills my criteria, but I haven't tested it myself on Mac. So if you're a Mac user, I'm going to put this website, this web post in the video notes. It's just the 10 best text editors for Mac, and please try them out. Try Atom. Sublime Text does not display the Tibetan well, so I would not use Sublime Text. At least there might be a way to fix it, but I couldn't get it to work. And that one I actually tried on a Mac. But there's Atom, which is working really well on PC. And I suspect that perhaps some of these other ones will work just as well. Perhaps BB Edit will work well, and perhaps VS Code. Where is that? That should be on this list somewhere. Yeah, Visual Studio Code will work really well. But the three criteria are: we need to see the Tibetan. It needs to show these numbers, line feed numbers, and there should be the third one is we need a soft wrap, which is something like this, where it wraps. We still get the line feed numbers, but we can see the full text. And some soft wrap is going to create a lot of lag, and we don't want any lag. We want to be able to do this efficiently and quickly. So you can try to be really picky about any lag, if there is any. The Atom seems to be working really well, and so I'm happy with this on PC. Please test it out on Mac and tell me how it goes. So yeah. So let me briefly explain a little bit how the text file is pre-segmented. We're running a script in the Tibetan that there's a word tokenizer called Paibo that identifies verbs and nouns, and then according to a set of rules, we break segments with a simple line break after certain verbs and particles. And there's more detail about that on the wiki page. So this is more of just a starting point, and you'll merge a lot of the breaks that were made by the script, and you'll add a lot of your own breaks. But you'll basically just do that with a return key and backspace. So like if I want to merge 5 and 4, I'd hit a backspace. If I want to split, I'd hit the return key. So when you're editing the alignment, two things to keep in mind. One, we're creating TMs from the segments, but we're also trying to keep a complete record of the bytext, which is basically the full alignment of all of the source and all of the translation. So we want to keep all the strings in there, even if they aren't present in the source or the translation. So for example, the the title is, you'll notice here the title isn't in the English. Actually, we're going to start adding the titles, but in this case, there's no title in the English text file. And then in the Tibetan, there's both a Sanskrit title and a Tibetan title. So I think when we start putting the titles in the English, you'll line that up with the Tibetan title, but you'll keep the Sanskrit one separate. But so basically, since this title isn't here, we want to break it off where the English begins. Homage to the omniscient one, Tamje Kempala Chaksalo. So yeah. So yeah, segment 1 is all of this, which is just going to be left empty in the English. And then segment 2, Tamje Kempala Chaksalo, is right here, homage to the omniscient one. And so we basically go through and edit like that. So for instance, dastada here at one time, dige daki tupa du jigna, looks good. Now for 4 here, the blessed one was dwelling. That's going to, of course, line up with the shukde. And so we, since shomdende is the subject and shukde is the verb, these two need to be merged. And when you merge, make sure that space remains. If it's missing, you can add that space. And then in the English as well, this should be all one segment. And so now we can see that 4 in the Tibetan lines up with 4 in the English. So occasionally we'll need to swap the order of the English. I think I have an example here. 27. I haven't aligned this text yet. I'm just using it to show you some examples of some operations you'll need to make. So this English here, those of unwholesome livelihood have no fear, even though they are bound to circle in samsara's ocean for countless aeons, always ensnared by afflictions. This is actually 2 segments that have the opposite order. The order was flipped from the original Tibetan. We have this Kelpa Chewa Trakya Drangmedu, that's for countless aeons they were bound in samsara and so forth. And then those of unwholesome livelihood have no fear. This is the Tsoa Marungpa di Trakmingyur. So because we're going to focus on the Tibetan grammar for creating our segmentation. So we basically need to move the English around to match that. And so we're just going to do a copy and paste. So I'll just highlight 27, Control X, and paste it in 29. And then this actually begins on 27, so we'll move it back here. And now they line up. Now, one of the problems about using this alternative method as opposed to InterText is that InterText is a lot more foolproof in terms of typos and accidental keystrokes. So I want you to be very careful, especially when copy and paste, and also in general, just be very careful not to accidentally add any characters to the Tibetan or English. We'll probably develop some scripts to just kind of check and make sure that not anything wasn't added or by accident. But I still just want you to be very mindful and make sure that regardless, be mindful and make sure you don't accidentally delete something or add or press a key with it unintentionally. So yeah, occasionally you'll need to swap English like that. And the other thing you'll occasionally need to do is reduplicate the English. Let me explain why here. So let's see, where's the, okay, it's 105. Since we're focusing on the Tibetan grammar while we're segmenting the text, occasionally, so we want to focus on the Tibetan grammar and generally not take too many cues from the English. This is so we can have a more consistent TM standard and thus make the TMs more useful. But occasionally, because of this standard, occasionally the English is going to compound two segments that we want separate according to the Tibetan. So for this example, we have, in the Tibetan, we have these three clauses, du kyangshe, tsu kyangshe, men kyangshe. So in Tibetan, notice that the first two clauses were compounded into a single clause in the English. He knows the phases and degrees, and then Menyangshe was given its own clause, he knows the cure. So arguably this could be considered a complete thought because these verbs are so closely related. But because in the Tibetan these are all on separate lines, we want to keep them separate. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to copy the English, Control copy, and then so make an exact copy of that segment, from start to finish. Basically, I don't want you to ever change the English translation. If you see an error, we have a flag for that, but since this is a finalized, it's been through a long editorial process, since this is the complete English and we're trying to make a complete bytext, I don't want you ever altering the English. But what we can do is we can duplicate strings and then bracket any words that don't line up with the corresponding Tibetan. So here for 105, we have du kyangshe in the Tibetan. So in the English, we can do, he knows the, do is going to be phases. So we can bracket out and the degrees. And then for tsu kyangshe, he knows the degrees. We can bracket out the phases. So let's only do this when you need to separate out an English sentence. Obviously English will add like pronouns, or it'll exchange pronouns with the proper noun or vice versa. You don't need to worry about that. But when you have to actually divide a single segment in the English between two segments in Tibetan, this is the method we're going to use. Just simply copy and then bracket things out. And again, be very careful not to accidentally delete something or add something that shouldn't be there. So now I just want to point out some of the tags we're using in our text files here. First thing you'll notice are these $ followed by a numeral. These correspond to milestones in the reading room. You can pretty much ignore these. They're basically just placeholders so that we can add them in as metadata when we finalize the TMs. So you can just basically ignore them. They come at the beginning of paragraphs usually. So just make sure they do, they appear at the beginning of a segment rather than the end if they become between two segments. So this $2 should be at the beginning of 3 here rather than the end of 2. You'll also notice these brackets. These are for folio numbers. They should usually correspond to what the folio numbers into Tibetan, but they're not always going to line up perfectly. They might be off one segment. Don't worry about that. That's fine if that happens. But just leave them in there, and this is just our folio reference to the original Tibetan. And then the other thing that you should pay more attention to is the hashtag keys, and these are just going to be in the English. I'll find one here. These correspond to endnotes in the reading room, on the reading room page. So, and the index number should match up to the index number in the 84,000 reading room. So as endnotes, they should actually, unlike the milestone references, the endnotes should be connected to what they're annotating. So they should appear at the end of a segment if it comes between two segments like this. But I want you to check those in the reading room while you actually don't have it open right now. But you would find 186 in the reading room, and you can just open the notes section in a separate page, and then you can just briefly check that note whenever you come across it. And the reason is we want to check for alternate sources or any explanation that explains why the translation is different or doesn't line up the way it should with the Dege. So occasionally the translator will have used a different edition of the Kangyur instead of the Dege. This, by the way, is all from the Dege. The e-Kangyur was based on the Dege. Or occasionally they'll use a Sanskrit or Chinese source. So you should just check to see, read that footnote. It'll probably be nothing relevant, but if it is relevant, if it says like, we translated this from the Sanskrit because it didn't make sense in Tibetan, then we need to flag that. We need to flag the corresponding Tibetan. So actually, I don't know where this Tibetan starts, but yeah, let's just pretend it starts here. I don't want to find it right now. Let's just pretend it lines up with 7. So we would, to flag a segment that is from an alternative source, I want you to go to the Tibetan segment, and at the very beginning of that segment, the initial character, add an exclamation point. Just one exclamation point like that. And so that's going to be our alternative source tag. And later on in a script, it'll go through and identify that as metadata. And we might even just leave that in there so that, because usually the TM will actually still be useful because it'll be pretty close to the English, might not be that off from what was in the Dege. But if the little exclamation point is there, then the translator will know that that the English isn't going to match up exactly because an alternate source was used. The other flag we're going to occasionally use, and this one we're going to put in the English, is if you suspect there is a error. If there's, sometimes it might be like a straight up typo in the English, or maybe they didn't translate a line of Tibetan and there's no footnote explaining why. That in that case we want to add a error flag. And I don't want you to, even if it's an obvious typo, I don't want you to correct it, because I'm gonna need to correct not only the TM, but we'll also want to go in and correct the publication as well, since these are published texts. And occasionally you're going to see some typos. So that's one advantage of doing this process, is you're taking a close look at the text. But our flag for a potential error is just a percentage sign. In the same way as the other error, we'll put this in the English, but it will be, in the same way, it'll be at the beginning of the segment. So, so sorry, the error flag goes in the English and the alternate source flag will go in the Tibetan. And we'll use a exclamation point and a percentage character as so. And so those are the two flags that we're going to use. And so that's basically it. The Mac users will be applying the same methodology as the Windows Linux users. They'll just be using this text file method. And I'm going to look into a few other, see if there's a better alignment software out there for Mac, but until then, I think this will work fine. Now, if you are, and so basically you'll just send me when you're finished editing, you'll save the text files and then you'll email them to me and I will merge them into a TMX file. Now, if you're not a 84,000 TM editor and you're just you're trying to use our methodology here, I'll just explain how you would create a TMX file from two text files. There's a few ways you could do this. You could maybe we'll make a simple script that would do this, but there's lots of simple workarounds. One, you could just copy the whole text, paste it into a spreadsheet so that each cell in one column will basically, if you paste it from a text file, it will place each line break into a separate cell. So you do that with the Tibetan in one column and then the English in another. Then you could upload it to SmartCat. That's SmartCat is just an online cat tool. And then you could export it as a TMX from there. Or you could also use InterText, that's probably actually easier. So just download InterText. Even if you're on a Mac, you can still use InterText to create an alignment between two files. So for example, you would just create a new alignment. We'll just call this test B. Declare your source as Tibetan, your target as English. And then, so when you import the file, you would just use you would have already edited all the segmentation according to line breaks. So for the dialog, you would just separate everything by line breaks. And then for the English, separate everything the same by line breaks. And then you would open it up. Oops. Wait, you wouldn't use hung align because because you wouldn't. It would already be lined up according to the line breaks, and then you can just export it as a TMX file. So that's one way you can do it. Okay, thanks. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments.